Welcome to the Healthcare Provider Happy Hour. This is a safe space where we invite healthcare providers to unapologetically be themselves after the working day. My name is Jennifer George, and each week I will connect you with guests and stories that will help transform your stress to success and fulfillment. Are you with me? Grab your drink of choice and let's chat. Hey everyone, welcome to the Healthcare Provider Happy Hour. I'm your host, Jennifer George, and I'm joining you with two special guests today, Bryan Guski and Tim Reynolds. Both are physical therapists. Bryan is an outpatient orthopedic physical therapist at the University of Rochester Medical Center, where he works primarily with patients with spine-related impairments. Tim is a clinical assistant professor of anatomy and physiology at Ithaca College, and he's a part-time physical therapist in Ithaca, New York as well, where he predominantly treats patients with spine or lower extremity impairments. So we're here mostly to chat about their book, actually, called Movers and Mentors, Leaders in Movement Science, Share Tips, Tactics, and Stories. Have you ever wanted to ask one of the experts in our field of physical therapy or physiotherapy, depending on where you live, kind of what their life was like? Rather than what they know, there used to be a time where I used to just want to acquire knowledge from these people. And now I really appreciate the book that Tim and Bryan have put out, because we start to see the human side of the experts in our field. And this is a great conversation that talks about how we can connect with their stories and gives validation to where we're at as clinicians and as human beings. I think it's an excellent book to have and own and refer to, and also one to gift to another clinician. So grab your drink of choice and join us for this conversation. Hi, Bryan. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Good. How are you guys?
Doing good.
Yeah,
Excited
it's
to be here
great.
today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys for joining me. I'm really excited about having this conversation because I really love when healthcare professionals use their creativity and bring something to benefit the profession still, right? You know, just through personal development and professional development combined. So I wanted to know more about you guys and tell us more about how you connected and what inspired this book.
Yeah, my name is Tim. I'm a physical therapist by trade. I'm a full-time professor at Ithaca College. I teach anatomy and physiology now. And so Bryan and I had an opportunity to go to physical therapy school together. We were both part of Ithaca College's 2014 graduating class. And so when we think back to our sort of origin story, it was probably in organic chemistry or bio or something like that. But we had the opportunity to graduate together. We were roommates for a little bit. And then after graduation, we both pursued orthopedic residency. And so we did that at Cayuga Medical Center in New York. And so through a lot of didactic coursework and a lot of weekend courses, Bryan and I had an opportunity to sort of get a chance to know each other a little bit better.
Wow. And so when did you, because I know in the States, I'm in Canada, I know in the States it's a doctorate program now, right? Like it's a DBT. Yep. So like how long was your schooling and when did you officially start practicing?
So at Ithaca College, where Tim and I both went, it was freshman admittance into the program. So it was a 6-year program kind of straight through. So you started as a freshman in the doctorate of physical therapy program and did essentially kind of 3.5 years undergraduate work, and then the remaining was more of our graduate oriented physical therapy work. So a little bit different than most programs. Most programs are like a 4 and 3 program, 4 years and 3 years, so 7 years total. But Ithaca was a little bit more of a fast track with a 6-year in that freshman admittance.
Yeah, that's kind of nice because here in Ontario, it's 6 years. So it's a 4-year undergrad and then a 2-year master's. So, so you get a doctorate in 6 years, 6.5 years. That's great. Yeah, really cool. And so what year did you start practicing?
So we started practicing in 2014. Is that right, Tim?
Okay.
Yeah, 2014 with the residency starting in 2015. And so, which was nice. I mean, people talk about the positives and negatives associated with the sort of residency fellowship training, but when I think back to the decision in terms of why I wanted to do residency, one of my mentors, who's in the book at the end of the chapter, Mike Costello, he was one of the driving factors, and him and John Winslow, another professor at Ithaca College, mentioned it's going to give you 5 years of clinical experience in a year. And so that concept of, well, I've just spent 6 years of investment of my time to try to better myself to be able to be an entry level clinician where I know nothing about anything in terms of clinical experience. If I can get fast tracked in terms of sort of gaining that knowledge and expertise now, that was the selling point for me.
Wow, that's actually a great piece of advice. Like just passing that forward from Mike. I think that's really good for students to hear, or for future providers to hear, is that experience is worth a lot in itself, right? Rather than just.
And I think Brian can obviously speak to this a little bit better. Brian, being the previous residency director at the University of Rochester, has dealt with a ton of residents through that program.
Yeah, that's I just actually stepped down from that position, but I was the director for our orthopedic residency program for 3 years, and that was one thing that we always, especially during our interviews and kind of recruitment process, the types of questions we would ask, wanting to know the why behind a new graduate, for instance, wanting to come and do a residency program, and we always looked for kind of some level of kind of curiosity and wanting to understand patients better and understand patients' problems better and get that experience and get that mentorship. So, we kind of ask the similar questions, to questions that Tim and I had to ask ourselves back in the day.
Right. And so after, just like you said, Tim, so now when people go through it, when students go through it, do they feel better afterward? Like, do they feel like they made the right decision? Do they feel like, even that was more time, do they feel like it was worth that?
I currently still teach in a residency program. And so my clinical practice, even though I'm part-time, I have active mentorship responsibilities and I teach 2 of our residency courses. And so we'll watch the transition of a student from January to December in preparation for them to graduate our residency program, then sit for orthopedic certification. And I would say their confidence growth, and granted, with any sort of continuous repetition, you'll gain confidence. But watching the clinical decision-making skills that a relatively new graduate has, I think having the opportunity to troubleshoot with mentors in the background and be able to sort of spitball ideas off of these quote unquote experts, if you would, within certain areas of specialty, that allows for them to navigate some of those speed bumps a lot quicker. And I think it's that pattern recognition and adaptation to X, Y, and Z downfalls that they are able to, I think, be a step above their peers. Because I remember being post-residency and having conversations with some of my classmates that I graduated with, and they were getting introduced to concepts probably 3 years after Brian and I were having sort of already gone through all of that training.
Wow.
And granted, the PT curriculum has changed significantly, even in the past 5 to 10 years. Concepts regarding like pain science and pain communication and stuff like that are significantly better. The mindfulness, I mean, think about your book in terms of communication is care, right? So understanding the influence that has on our patients' outcomes, that was something that we sort of glossed over in our doctoral training. And so, no, I think everybody that goes through the experience comes out with a lot of benefit.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's super like well-rounded. They just come across as just growing overall more and more. So that's great. I think I mean, we all got, like, I shouldn't say we're not guaranteed time, but when you're that young, like, to me, looking back, like, another year for all of that valuable experience to me just makes sense. So you're both in the orthopedic field, like that's your specialty, would you say? I don't think in Ontario we're allowed to claim a specialty unless we've gone through a specialty program. But in the States, you're able to say like you're a specialist in orthopedics. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah. So after you can say you're a specialist after you sit and pass your orthopedic certified specialty exam or neurologic specialty exam or cardiopulmonary. So we have different kind of specialties within the field, and you have to either fulfill a certain amount of years in practice or go through a residency program in order to get that specialist certification.
Okay, cool. And so when you guys came together to write the book, can you tell me about that moment where you guys thought, hey, let's do something with all of this valuable information?
Yeah. So Tim and I were actually going through residency together when we came up with the idea. We were being force-fed, in lack of a better phrase, a lot of information and content in the physical therapy space, and we started seeing a lot of kind of reoccurring names coming up: researchers, business leaders, innovators within the field. Stu McGill being one of them, John Childs, Peter O'Sullivan, David Butler. A lot of these names just kept coming up, and we thought there was something to that. And we were also reading a book called Tools of Titans by Timothy Ferriss at the time, which is kind of a similar interview type book where he interviews leaders and business innovators and influencers from various different sectors. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Brene Brown, Tony Robbins, kind of really high level individuals. And we both really liked that book. And so one day, I turned to Tim and I said, wouldn't it be cool if we had a book like this that just pertained to physical therapy and kind of our interests? And so we kicked that around for a couple of years. And then in 2018, we kind of sat down and decided we were going to do it. We put together a list of names. We're calling a lot of those names that, were coming up during our residency training, but then added a lot of new names, put down a list of questions that we wanted to ask them, and sent out many, many emails. And from there, we were rolling.
So did everyone respond? Of all, like, you have quite a list, like it's quite exhaustive. Yeah. Did everyone get back to you, or were you surprised?
It's one of the challenging things at the time, Jen, is that the world really shifted in the 3 months when we started to send out some of these emails. So like Brian said, we sort of created this dream team, if you would, of clinicians that we thought would be valuable, not only for sort of the contributions that they made for the profession, but what sort of insight would they be able to provide young adults, students, and current practicing clinicians. And so as we're coming up with that list of individuals, we had no idea how this would be received in the physical therapy community.
Really?
I think it's one of those things. Well, it's one of those things.
Tell me more.
We sit down, we have this idea. We're just two kids that just finished residency. And we're like, I think this would be super cool. But who are we in the world of physical therapy at the time, right? And so for us to send an email to someone like Peter O'Sullivan or Shirley Sarman and expect them to respond to us, there was a lot of own personal growth and development during that time frame also. And our sort of comfort level in terms of the ask has, I'd say, greatly changed in the past 2 years. But we're sending out these emails initially, and we sent out a couple at a time. And then I remember Brian and I calling each other, and it was like kids on Christmas morning about how excited we were that someone got back to us. I think it was Adrian Lau got back to Brian, and Louis Puentadora got back to me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So we take these initial responses, but then we're sort of navigating the fact that some of the individuals we were emailing had the Australian wildfires. And so that was right at the start of 2020. And so a lot of that Australian cohort, who are sort of movers and shakers, if you would, within the physical therapy realm, had other stuff on their plate, which then segued right into the global pandemic. And so one of those things to take in consideration is, we had a pretty big master list. By no means is that list completely inclusive, because the book would be 1,000 pages or 5,000 pages long if we tried to include everybody that's influenced the profession in some way, shape, or form. But at the same time, we had some people say, no, I'm just too busy at the moment, or I'm on sabbatical. I've told myself I'm not taking on other responsibilities, which is perfectly valid and fair. And so while we did capture a lot of individuals within this book, this is not necessarily a complete final iteration of movers and mentors, because there are still movers out there that we have not had an opportunity to talk to. And in the next 5 years, there's going to be a whole new set of clinicians that are changing and challenging the profession to move forward.
Right. But hopefully this continues to lead others, right? And I got to say, when I wrote my book, I had to reach out to like some executives, at certain organizations about it and stuff. And I would just simply reach out and I would meet with the CEO, let's say. And when I would tell people these stories, they were like, you actually reached out to a CEO? Like they were so, and I said, yeah. And I said, they were actually quite pleasant and they were very approachable. And it's so interesting how we can talk ourselves out of opportunities sometimes. You really got to follow, I find, that giddiness. Like you guys had that giddiness about you, where you were like, this is so cool. This would be great to do. And then, but we can sometimes sabotage that momentum, right? So I'm glad you didn't let that happen.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like bias or fear that happens. And Tim and I definitely had both of those things. When we started sending out emails, like we talked ourselves out of the plan on a couple occasions, and finally we're just like, we just gotta click send and just see what happens. And then I would say, and compared to what we thought going into this process, there was overwhelming support and an overwhelming number of responses compared to what we thought, because these are really busy people that we were reaching out to, and people that have a lot on their plate, and for them to take an hour to talk to us was awesome. So we're very, very grateful. But as you said, Jen, it's like sometimes you just gotta put yourself out there and see what happens.
Yeah, it's like it's really stepping out of your comfort zone there. And even the no's were like, I can't right now, right? So, I mean, there could be a second edition, probably, right? As time goes on. So it was a phone interview? Because there was a lot of questions that you were asking, right? There was at least 10 or so. There were certain questions you guys had asked.
So there's like sort of a combination of stuff that we wanted to not be more of an inconvenience than we already were.
Right. That's what I'm getting at. Like, what was the method? Or
so obviously there's this initial cold call email that we reached out, seeing is there an interest level of being willing to participate in this project, and then from there understanding that, like Brian said, they have their own schedules that they have to navigate, and they have a whole bunch of other things on their plate. And sometimes it's different time zones, sometimes it's different countries. And then there's academia on top of research, on top of clinical care. And so we did conduct a large majority of our interviews via Zoom, which was great, because then we have to have an opportunity to have dialogue and communication that wasn't necessarily entirely scripted. One of the benefits of that is that we were able to sort of navigate the conversation in different areas and then be able to sort of see how things flowed. One of the negatives associated with that is if you try to transcribe an hour and a half Zoom interview, you're sitting there probably 4 times the length of the interview as the time it takes to transcribe it.
They don't have software for that yet, eh? Like audio to print.
They do, but it's not great. Yeah, there's a lot of misspelled words that you just you're correcting so much that you think, I'm just going to type this thing out. And
so there's a good portion that we did that way. Some people chose to type their responses, and if I were in that situation, that might be more of my route if I was being interviewed, because some of the questions that we ask are tough. And I think it's one of those things to sort of come up with those off the cuff might be a little bit more challenging. And so sort of a good mix in terms of our responses.
What was the one question, or maybe 1 or 2 questions, that you were most like excited to ask, or you wanted to learn mostly about? I'm sure they all meant like importance to you, right? But was there one that kind of like you were just like, I wonder what their responses will be to this?
Yeah, I think mine, and Tim might agree with this, but he probably has another one in mind too, was favorite failure. Was really, really interesting. I mean, really kind of the full spectrum, from some of our guests referencing specific patient cases that they failed on that taught them a lot. That was kind of a turning point in their career. Some not getting into physical therapy school for several times, but then finally getting in and realizing that, that's where I needed to be. Others failing their board exams and having to do special training, and that special training can be under some kind of mentor that then guided them on a new track that changed their career path. So it was really, really interesting to hear about failures, and more interesting to hear about what kind of track or avenue it put that person on thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sort of piggybacking off of that, being in academia and having the opportunity to influence so many students. So I have roughly 180 students that take the introduction to anatomy physiology during an academic year. And the type of individual that sits in my class is typically more of a type A personality that wants to succeed, that tries really hard. And I think normalizing the concept of failure with regards to this subgroup of our healthcare, like the future of our healthcare, is really valuable, because I think failure gets such a negative connotation and then is not necessarily associated with growth and development. It's always focused on the negative repercussions associated with it. And so to be able to share, like Bryan was saying, some of these stories in which, like, it's okay that you failed. How are you gonna bounce back off of that? I think that's what's really valuable, and one of the things I hope that our students, our young professionals that read the book, have a chance to sort of appreciate. In terms of some of the other questions, I think not necessarily one question in particular, but I appreciated the breadth of questions that we asked that weren't necessarily clinical in nature. Because I think when you go on Instagram, for instance, there's so much content that's being sort of force-fed like a fire hose, that there's so much information that you're able to receive. And obviously it's up to the viewer in terms of whether or not they want to disseminate that as valuable clinical advice or whatnot. But no one's really sharing what's the 3 books that influenced their life, right? Or if you had to navigate a stressful situation, what do you do? And I think it's one of those things that obviously we can look to motivational speakers, kind of like Bryan was talking about, Arnold Schwarzenegger or Tony Robbins or some of these, Brene Brown puts out these inspirational quotes. I think we expect those kind of responses from those individuals, but that's not necessarily our direct sphere of people that we might be following. And so it's nice to be able to humanize, if you would, some of these individuals that we see as movers and shakers within our profession, and understand that they're more than just the 3 back exercises that they broadcast all the time. And so I think the more everyday person, kind of normal conversation questions were the ones that I really appreciated as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. For me too, like I was going to say that the questions were not so clinical, right? Like they were really just about, like you said, just humanizing healthcare providers and movers and shakers in this particular profession. And I think that's partly maybe why you got such a great response as well, I think, is because you have to wonder if a student or a future therapist were to have the opportunity to meet with one, I think it would be a lot of it would be clinically focused, right? Like they would just kind of acquire as much knowledge as possible, but just to ask them questions like human to human. I think it's a good opportunity for them to also showcase that part of themselves as well, which we don't learn about, right? And I think we associate as clinicians failure with harm, when, in terms of patient safety, and in school, and maybe in post-grad courses and things like that, we associate it with being inadequate and not being enough, right? And, I've seen this competitive side to physiotherapy and the culture of it. And, I'm hoping that's why I've done this podcast, to kind of contribute in my way, because I think we're all more alike than we are different, regardless of our, expertise and our titles. And it's kind of just, that when I started this podcast, I actually took away from a lot of people in personal development as well in the podcasting industry. And I'm just kind of like, and I'm applying this stuff in my own everyday life. And, other clinicians asking me kind of how I'm maintaining, preventing burnout, and how I'm continuing to maintain motivation and things like that in my personal life. I thought, it really is a combination of things. It wasn't because of my clinical experience per se, or my clinical knowledge, right? It was my whole being.
I think that's one of the valuable things that, looking back when we were sort of navigating PT school, these were the conversations that weren't really being had.
Exactly.
Like, I don't remember, and Bryan, you can sort of jump in. I don't really remember a conversation about burnout, or like burnout really being a hot topic at that point in time. But Then I remember being on rotation and being like, man, this sort of like gets old kind of quick when you see 25 patients in a day.
Yeah.
Am I going to be able to do this for the next 35 years? I really don't think that that's a feasible life choice. And so I think having those resources like your podcast, like your book, like these conversations that we're asking these individuals allows for that idea of, no, those feelings that you're having, you're not alone. Because I
Hmm.
think those are conversations that are also kind of taboo, especially when you say, I just spent 6 or 7 years, I just spent potentially upwards of $300,000 on this potential career choice. And I'm already questioning whether or not this is something I want to be doing. And
Yeah.
so, how do I come to my professor and say, hi, so and so, I really don't think this is for me, or to your parents, or to your cohort, because it's that concept of, did I fail? Did I
Right.
what's wrong with me that I'm not getting the satisfaction associated with this? And so I
Yeah.
think being able to see, and one of the questions that we ask is, when you're feeling overwhelmed, like what do you do? What do you ask yourself in order just to reset? And that's like a low key way of potentially talking about burnout without saying the burnout word. And so
Hmm.
having that opportunity to say, okay, well, these are the strategies that Tim Flynn uses, and this is what Josh Cleland does amongst publishing like a million articles, right?
Right.
How did these individuals in the status that they have with all the responsibility, how do they stay fired up about the profession? And so I think that's one of those things that, yeah, kudos to you for sort of taking that initiative in terms of trying to be a voice and be a resource, because I think it's,
Thank
if
you.
we can have a more accepting conversation associated with that, it will not necessarily be this dark cloud associated with the healthcare industry.
Right. Yeah. And even going back to what you said about social media and just it being so content driven in some cases, I think partly some of that is to market to potential clients maybe as well. But I know for me, I've stopped like following a lot of that type of content because it's not what I'm most interested in. But I mean, I still obviously have to have the knowledge and the competency and all of that stuff. It's just not where I choose to put all of my, spare time in, right? We're on our phones a lot. We're scrolling social a lot. So I just like to see more diverse, more whole content out there. So yeah. So, and that's really why I was excited to have you guys on this podcast too, because you've validated a lot of what people are feeling out there. And one of the stories I read on your website by Shirley Sarman, like, absolutely loved that story. Like, for her to, like, I wouldn't have imagined her having said that, like, admitting that her brother had been killed and like talking about like that. To me, like, that's powerful. Like, that's what I want to hear more about as a clinician, or those stories where people have experienced either trauma or they've experienced lived experiences that, while they were trying to better themselves and get their education and help others, they were still resilient during that time. So yeah, her story really touched me. I really liked that one. So
Yeah,
yeah.
she gave a great interview, great information,
Yeah.
and very very insightful, and just so much experience. And one thing that you mentioned earlier, Jen, about kind of the conflict or competition, or kind of the discussion amongst individuals of different treatment paradigms. And Tim and I definitely, we were well aware when we were sending out these emails. We were like, okay, we're including some really heavy like pain people, some really heavy spine stability people, some really heavy motor control, just kind of across the map. Postural Restorative Institute, PRI. We included everyone, but we did that for a reason, and that's because we wanted our book and the questions to be agnostic of whatever treatment paradigm you're in, or whatever philosophy you're in. We wanted to get to the human oriented questions like we were talking about before. And yeah, I mean, Tim and I joke, if we wanted to go look and see how Stu McGill or Shirley Starman progresses, their abdominal strengthening programs, I could search that on Google and probably find it
Exactly.
and learn it. But if I want to know Shirley Starman's greatest failure, or her recommendation to new young professionals, that's something that you can't find, and that's really kind of at its origin, the purpose of this book is to really get to those things that you can't find anywhere else. So yeah, that was a very powerful interview with Shirley.
That's awesome. Yeah, and that's what helps your readers to connect, right? And and then they might research her more and more, right? Like they'll just be more intrigued by her, and they might discover something about themselves that, like you said, Tim, earlier, if people feel like they're failing the profession, but rather maybe their spark's just not been lit yet, right? And it could be that story that does that.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of just touched real quick on, and maybe they'll do some research on her and find out more. And I think that's also part of the excitement associated with this project, that there's individuals in here that are not necessarily known within the profession, right? And obviously, if you ask 100 different clinicians, they'd have 100 different movers and shakers that they perceive should be part of this project. But when we look through and sort of figure out who did we want to interview, there was no, Brian and I've joked about this before, there's no spreadsheet where we said they published 6 articles, check. So they've done that, and they're a professor at this, check, right? So there's no
criteria.
There's no criteria associated with that. So obviously there's a lot of freedom of choice, but also a lot of responsibility in terms of how do we sort of navigate the situation. But institutions like the National Association for Black Physical Therapists, we had the opportunity to interview both of their founding members. And I think it's one of the things that when we look at sort of the diversity associated with healthcare and who has a voice within our profession, that's one of those things that I hope that there's students of color that read this book and then say, oh, wow, this is an institution or this is an organization that might be able to speak to me. Or if someone that wants to, we talked about different silos of practice where there's pain individuals who predominantly focus on pain rehab or pain research, and then stabilization or MDT and all these other sort of subclassifications. If that is an interest for them, I hope that they now go and research those individuals. So I hope that it brings a whole new clientele, if you will, to these different movers and shakers, because essentially you're getting 75 plus mentors in one book, right? And so you're able to pick and choose and sort of cherry pick who do you want to speak your language, and then potentially dive into their research or their articles or their blogs or podcasts or whatnot from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and get excited about it. Yeah, like it could really reinvigorate someone. I think it was Robin Sharma, and maybe other people have said this too, but oftentimes people will say, when you read a book, you're basically having a conversation with the author. So this really is like a way for readers to have a conversation with all of the people you've interviewed. And for sure, like you said, Tim, anybody who picks up the book and reads the book will be able to connect with at least one or recognize the name of at least one person, because you've had such a big sample of guests, which is amazing. So what has been the feedback from people who've read the book? Have you heard much from other clinicians, or have non-clinicians even read it just to see and just learn some lessons on life?
My grandmother brought 3 copies, so this is
I hear you.
Real big fan of the book.
When we publish this,
family's the best.
And then I joke that we'd sell at least 5 copies, and 2 of them would be my parents, 2 of them would be Tim's parents, and then we would each buy one. So I guess that would be 6. But no, it's been. It's been really good. We've gotten great feedback. Again, just thanking everyone that has bought the book and reached out and told us about it, and kind of how it's making them think more about certain things. And we've had some guests send us pictures through social media of them highlighting and writing notes in it, and taking using sticky notes, kind of using it as morning motivation. Some people are telling us. It's been really cool. It's been a neat experience for both of us.
And I think one of the other things that's exciting is obviously hearing back from our readers, but when our contributors get excited, that's so rewarding, I think, just for all the effort that we've put into this project. And so we'll see when someone received their copy of the book, like when we send a desk copy, if you would, to that individual, and they post something about, so excited to have the opportunity to put my hands on this and dive into this. I've been waiting to see this, and to see the people that we perceive as our sort of PT heroes
Yeah.
get excited to read either about what they wrote or read about the other individuals within the book. That's been awesome as well. And like
Wow.
Brian said, I'd say overall really positive. Starting to sort of navigate certain schools. I want to include it in part of their professional development curriculums and stuff like that.
Great.
Because I do think it is one of those things that would be valuable. This would be a book that I would have read when I was in PT school and would have found value. And Brian said it before, where we created a book that we wanted to read. And having that sort of confidence and truth within that statement, yes, this is a book that I would read because I think it is that valuable of a resource. And if I could find it and flash back to 2013, 2014, when I needed a little bit of guidance in my physical therapy career, like you said, Jennifer, there would have at least one individual that would have spoken to me, and I would have been able to sort of take guidance within their words.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to say it would make a great gift for a student, like as a clinician in mentoring a student. And I can totally picture you guys like book signing at universities and colleges, because I really think, and I had interviewed Josh Cutler, who's a social worker, a few weeks back, and he wrote a memoir about his struggle with mental health. And he's a social worker. He's a licensed psychotherapist, and he's making some big waves in accessibility for healthcare providers and people in general to access mental health services through telling his story. And I think it's just so powerful. Like, these are the books that we need to see more in education, because you could read it and refer back to it for years to come, like through school, but also beyond that as well.
I keep a copy on my desk, and so I have an open door office hour policy. And so if my door is open, feel free to stop by. And I'll not necessarily just have students from this current semester come in, but previous students that I've taught. And there was at one point one student that was talking about sort of the concept of imposter syndrome and not really feeling like they're surrounded by all these clinicians in this room, and how am I supposed to be stepping up to the plate and treating to the level of my preceptors? And I flipped to Mike Reynolds' chapter, and he has closing thoughts where he talks about how to become an expert. And I'm like, you're going to read this. I'm going to go heat up my lunch, but we'll have a conversation when I'm back. And so I gave him the copy of the book, and I just said, read this paragraph in half. And he's like, okay, that makes sense. That makes me feel a little bit better. And it's one of those things that it's like, you can read this as a novel. You could start and go from beginning to end, or you could use it like an encyclopedia and go through and highlight everybody's failures and then try to navigate which one of those speaks to me. Or you can go person by person and then revert back to the stories that you need sort of to refresh yourself with. So I think it's a great sort of resource for those students, and has been a good resource for me to be able to sort of call upon.
It's great. So tell me too, like now you guys have done all of this. You've combined your own experiences, I'm sure, and have connected with each and every one of these contributors. So if you had somebody who was mentoring under you, so whether it's your students or whatnot, what is like the one thing that you would really want them to walk away from from their experience with you knowing? What do you think is one thing that they really would need to know right now? And I mean, this could always change, right? But currently, based on where you're at and all that you've done and accomplished so far.
I mean, I think it's one of those things that if we were speaking to the book specifically, one of the commonalities is that everybody fails, right? And so I think if I had to share like what's one message from the book, it'd be everybody fails. And how you perceive that failure and how you navigate that failure sort of dictates your future. And so do you accept that failure and then leave it at that and don't necessarily try to learn or grow and develop from it? Or do you embrace this failure and then try to figure out what's the next path that this leads me down? Right? Brian mentioned it earlier where, yes, I failed my board exam, but then that set me up with mentorship, which then led to me taking on X, Y, and Z job. And so understanding that sort of everything happens for a reason, as cliche as that sounds, but the concept of everybody fails. I fail, you fail. You're walking in the footsteps of everybody that's been before you. And understand that those footsteps, even though they might be large at times, everybody's been there. And I think that would be sort of one of the common themes that I would share to others, or to my own sort of mentees, if you would, as they're trying to read this book.
Awesome. Love that. How about you, Bryan?
Yeah, this is tough. But it was kind of alluded to a few times throughout the book, this concept of finding things that excite you, find things that bring you joy, and try to do more of those things. And so I guess I would want, if I were mentoring someone, to come out knowing that each of us has kind of a unique set of abilities or superpowers, if you will. We're all really good at some things. Not everything. Nobody's good, really good at everything, but everyone's really good at some things. And how do you align those things with your personal mission and your purpose? And if you can do that, and if you can marry those things, if you can align your unique abilities and your superpowers, if you will, with kind of your personal career mission or your professional mission, I think that's when you really stay engaged, and I think you're happiest and you're feeling the most fulfilled with your professional life. At least I think if those two things are disjointed or they don't align, then that's when you struggle, and that's when you feel disengaged, or that's when you might feel burnout, or that's when you feel you don't want to go on that path anymore. So I think that takes talking to people, that takes doing research, certainly takes doing your due diligence to have conversations about what opportunities are out there and what, within the physical therapy space, what opportunities are there. But if you can align those things, your abilities with your mission and your purpose, then I think that's when you're happiest.
Yeah, I totally can echo that. And also too, like when they don't align and they are disjointed, I think is also helpful. And, kind of going back to what you said, Tim, a little bit in terms of failure, right? It's not necessarily a failure, but I think it's a redirection. And I think it's just so important to stay in tune with yourself. Like you said there, if it's not aligning, then there's something that's off, and, seek the help to kind of get back on track.
Karen Litzy, one of our contributors, mentioned the concept of saying yes to something is saying no to something else. And I think you sort of tie that, what Bryan and Jen for years both talking about, in terms of, does that line up with your values? Does that line up with your joy? Does that line up with who you are as an individual? And I think, one of the things that I struggle with personally is the concept of saying no, right? And so you can say yes to so many things and take on so many opportunities, but then that is saying no to either you, your family members, your friends, your mental health, right? And so that idea of, find joy, because if that lights you up on the inside, then that's going to allow for you to take on X, Y, and Z responsibilities in the future, because you've sort of taken care of yourself more. And so I think that idea, especially in healthcare, especially in today's day and age, with everything that's going on and the trials and tribulations associated with insurance policies and COVID-19 and all this sort of stuff, we need to be better, compassionate people to ourselves. And I think that understanding of what do we need to do to sort of take care of you, I think that's more important now than ever. So
yeah, even for me, like if I get excited by things and I say yes to them, like I'm becoming more aware of the fact that even if they all could potentially bring me joy, I'm becoming more aware of the fact that they're still going to take energy and they're still going to take time from me, or something's going to give, like you said, if it's going to be my own well-being. So I'm learning that. I'm learning more about that for myself, and I'm learning. It's been hard, but I'm doing it. So if you guys could sit down with anybody in the world, like I know you're quite versed in the personal development space too. If you could sit down with anyone and ask them any of these questions as well from your book, who would it be? Just one person. It doesn't have to be the right person, just whoever you're thinking about right now that comes to mind.
Oh boy, that's a good question.
I wish people could see you guys right now. Just how you're reflecting. I love it.
Obviously my answer would probably change every day or within the hour as I reflect on it more. One of the things that I've been working on myself, and Jennifer, you're talking about sort of, I'm working on the opportunity to say no to things, and just my own sort of personal mental health and well-being. I recently read Daring Greatly from Brene Brown. And I was like, you're speaking my language. Like everything you're saying is like coming up with X, Y, and Z that speaks to me. And so as I'm trying to figure out my own self more and actually allowing myself to become vulnerable enough, I think the conversations in regards to vulnerability and shame and understanding that, you talk about taboo, like we were talking about burnout being taboo, talk about shame and vulnerability being taboo, right? So I think if I could sit down and have dinner with Brene Brown and let her sort of deconstruct me as a person a little bit more, that'd probably be a worthwhile conversation. So
I think that would be a really good conversation. I think you'd walk away like a whole new person. What about you, Bryan?
I just finished a book called Change Maker by John Berardi, who is one of the founders of Precision Nutrition. It's called Change Maker: Turn Your Passion for Health and Fitness into a Powerful Purpose and a Wildly Successful Career. And I've listened to a few of his interviews about the book, and he's very insightful. He's very transparent in that he's an introvert, and I'm also kind of an introvert. And he talks about how he navigated that in the early kind of startup days of Precision Nutrition, when he was having to juggle, multiple things and wear multiple hats, and how he felt like he was just working and not fulfilling his kind of true purpose and mission. So if I could sit down and have I don't think he drinks coffee, but if I could have a coffee and maybe he could have tea, and if we could chat about life, I think that would be really insightful.
It sounds like it. Dare I ask you, really, what's next for you both? Like, really, you guys are super busy. Like, let's be honest. And you've put so much into this work over the last few years. Or are you just enjoying it right now?
This probably turns into another conversation for my therapist in terms of my quest for dopamine. And so, no, I think this has been such an awesome platform. In all seriousness, and this opportunity has been something that, when I reflect on this past year, talking about things that fill you up from an emotional joy standpoint, never have I ever perceived that this would be where I would be at with regards to talking about a book that Bryan and I put out, right? So I never imagined this being one of our sort of ventures, because we've had many conversations about things that we wanted to do, and to actually see this one follow through was great. In terms of what's next, in terms of movers and mentors, there are more movers and mentors that we would like to get in touch with. So having the opportunity to potentially explore maybe a second iteration of this project would be something in the near future. We've sort of kicked around the idea of starting a podcast and potentially having a little bit more audio associated with these conversations. And so I think that is something that, as we look at our time allocation to we're able to give to ourselves, but also to this project, if we have time to potentially pursue that also, we're looking into that. So
wonderful. Yeah, I could totally see the podcast evolving from this. How about you, Bryan?
Yeah, I think same. Yeah, I think in terms of where we want to take movers and mentors, we would definitely like to do a second volume, if you will. There's so many people that we have now come across or met, just having gone through this process, that we now want to reach out to. Also have some other ideas about maybe different kind of study aids or clinical, more clinical oriented books that we'd like to maybe put together as well. So we got a long list that we're working our way through. But yeah, in the near future, probably a podcast, hopefully, so we can have more in-depth conversations and hopefully a second book.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, it's been so nice having you both here. I could chat with you a lot longer about all of this. I just find one topic leads to another. But where can people pick up the book? Where can they buy it?
They can find our book on Amazon. Everything is right through Amazon. We have a Kindle version as well as paperback version. They can search us at moversandmentors.com, and they can go on our website, and that will give a sample of the book. Give a little bit more about the book, and then also there's links to Amazon on there. We're at Movers and Mentors on Instagram and Twitter as well.
Yeah, I really enjoy your Twitter. I'm mostly present on Instagram. I really enjoy your Instagram posts of just the clippets that you share. Yeah, Really, really good. So I highly recommend people follow them because again, I just find you post them almost daily, so they're a good dose of inspiration as well for clinicians too.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining me. I wish you both the best in the near future. I know there's a lot more to come, and just thanks for inspiring the future generation. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Jen. We really appreciate it.
Jennifer.
Thank you. So if you guys like this podcast, please subscribe and leave an honest review. Your feedback means everything to me. Your reviews are what moves this podcast forward, and I always appreciate receiving them. If you want to get a hold of me directly, reach out to me on social media. My handles are in the show notes, and you can always subscribe to my weekly newsletters at jennifergeorge.co so that we can stay connected. So until next time, thank you guys so much again for your ongoing support.